Does anyone have any questions for Cristina?
You don't have any information about how that happened. Can you explain a little bit of what that looked like for you? And is there a contact in that police department that you get information from, or?
The best way to sum up the problem with that is when I went to speak to the police department, the only thing that really stands out in my mind is their discussion of the tragic lack of funding in the police department, which I would never accuse them of trying to solicit a bribe, but I heard an awful lot about that lack of funding. So I'm not really getting my hopes up there.
How have you continued to honor the memory of your mum and dad?
This question makes me nervous. Every year on their birthdays, on Mother's Day, Father's Day, I have a friend who texts me and asks me that exact question. I'll go to the place where I spread their ashes regularly. It's sort of hard to go there and it's a little out of the way, but it's a really peaceful place. Because my dad was really into photography, I guess I inherited the camera. And so I spent a lot of time trying to use that, trying to actually learn how to do that properly. I don't know, it's a hard question to answer, but I try to keep doing that, the things that I had in common with them, things that remind me of them.
And did you have support at all from friends or other family members? And do you still have that support?
Some of my really good friends are over there. No, they were great. They tolerated all the surprise crying and blanket covering. Because I didn't really know how to do anything, they'd come over and cook together, and so they helped me a lot by trying to figure out a lot of the sort of basic things, and then eventually I needed that less and less. But that was huge. That was enormously helpful because I didn't have the time to sit and think about it and worry about my feelings when I didn't know how to function day to day. So that was really big, but they're fantastic. So they're still around. They're great.
Thanks, Cristina. You mentioned when you first came across BC victims of homicide that they said, well, you haven't had much therapy, and people seek therapy in many different ways, and there's many different paths to healing and moving forward. So I'm wondering what what did you do to move forward? What was your therapy? And some people seek one-on-one sort of counseling or therapy, and some people find it more in a group type setting. Did you find the group type setting therapeutic at all? And were there other things that you did in moving forward?
I did both. I eventually realized that this was pretty traumatic. It's probably the sort of thing you should get professional help for, or at least try. The very first time I actually went to an individual counselor, the guy stared at me blankly and had no idea what to say to me for that whole hour, so I didn't go back. But I get really different things from individual counseling versus group counseling, because the group is all about validation. It's all about realizing you're not actually alone, you're not doing it wrong, this is normal, it's the whole cliche, it's a normal reaction to abnormal situation. That's a big thing that I got from the group, whereas individual counseling is more, all right, you learned how to be independent. That's good. That's really good. Now let's take that down a notch because you've gone a bit too far. So that's really more of the kind of practical learning to open up more and learning to ask for help again that I really get from the individual counseling. But like I said up there, it's really hard for me to try to define what I did. So when you say there's different paths to healing, I'm sure there's other minor rituals I have for myself that are helpful and probably therapeutic, but I couldn't really describe them right now.
Thanks for sharing your story. Did you experience any difficulties reaching out for help through crime victim services when you were finally able to look for help or ask for help?
That was a little complicated because the deaths had occurred in Romania. The Department of Justice does have the program for Canadians victimized abroad. So when I had to go to Romania, they reimbursed me for my plane ticket, and they offered a certain amount for counseling as well. But the whole reaching out for services thing, that's why when I said, when I listed the things that helped me get through, I started with luck, because almost all of the services that I found was because of luck. The Canadian pension plan has orphan benefits for children under 18 and people under 25 who are in school. And the only reason I learned about those is because the people at the funeral home took pity on me, printed out all of the forms, helped me fill them out, walked me all the way to Service Canada, and handed it in. And I had no idea that existed. I had no idea the Department of Justice program existed until my friend's mom mentioned it. And even finding BC victims of homicide, that was lucky. That was because I happened to be on Craigslist at the right time. So I really wish that people were more aware of the services that were available before the crime occurs, because it is so hard to try to find this stuff when you're not thinking straight.
When did you immigrate to Canada?
In 95.
In 95? And how long ago did your parents pass away?
2009.
Oh, okay. So the services that are available, like these support services and what you're talking about with orphan benefits and things like that, when did they become available to like new Canadians? Because obviously that would be something that would be available to people born in Canada, but are those things that in like a community like Surrey where there's so many immigrants, would those benefits be available to them like relatively new? Like would they have to have their citizenship, or is it something that's not available to everybody?
As far as I'm aware, the orphan benefits are through the Canada Pension Plan, so you have to pay into the pension plan, okay. And the amount you get might, in some cases, depend on how long you've paid into it. Okay. I'm not entirely clear on all of the requirements of that, but there's actually a list. I put this all together of all the financial services that I'm aware of for people who have lost someone to homicide or have been the victim of a crime or have lost someone important. So death benefits, crime victim assistance program and all that. And I have links to all the actual requirements for that. So that's on the BC VOH website. Okay. If you click on the links, they might have more about that. But I've never actually seen anything about new immigrants or how long it takes before you're actually available for that. That's a good question.
For me, when our son died, my husband was a funeral director here at Valley View Funeral Home, and I also worked here. And I had worked for the BC Bereavement Helpline. And when Delta Victim Services came to our door to support us, they were embarrassed about the package they gave us because a lot of the material had my name on it. I had written it. But we didn't know half of the services that victim services could support us with. It wasn't until a year later when I spoke at the Victim Service Conference that a woman in the audience said to me, "Have you done this? Do you know about that? What about this?" I was like, no. That so often I hear from families, and I can say this myself, we were not aware and didn't know how to reach out to victim service people. to help us with those things. You know, we would get that phone call every couple of weeks, you know, how you doing? Yeah, fine. Is there anything we can help you with? No, it's okay. It's okay. And I hear that from families, and I also hear it, the frustration often that the victim service worker has too, that how do we get to the families and get that information out about what we can do to help them. So hopefully we'll hear some of that today and maybe enlighten all of us and to pass that information on to other families and people that we connect with.
Thank you for sharing your story. I just thought about the camera. Do you think that keeping some of those memories help you continuously remember, cope with the loss? Or some of the objects perhaps you kind of want to, don't mean to say like throw them away, but kind of slowly move away from them, because when my brother passed away, we tried to hide his pictures away from our mother secretly so she doesn't know, and other things. I was just wondering if you could comment on that. That just came to my mind now. Thank you very much.
I lived with them, and it was really hard staying in that apartment because it felt like a tomb. There was their whole bedroom that I just never touched. So I actually started getting rid of things really quickly. I started getting rid of some of their clothes, some of the furniture that I didn't particularly like. I started doing it so early that I was still nervous that they would walk back in and get mad at me for getting rid of the dining room table. But it helped me to sort of change the layout, to get a couple new pieces of furniture, because then it didn't feel so much like I was living in a tomb and I hadn't moved on at all. And eventually I moved out of that apartment because now that I have the camera, I have my mom's jewelry, I have the things that were actually important to them. And so I can look at those or use those, and it's special, it's a connection to them. It's not, it's not like living in a shrine. It doesn't feel as, it is completely overwhelming walking into the apartment, my old apartment, and until it looked a little different, because it was just, that was what it looked like when I had parents, and I needed it to not look like that anymore because they weren't going to be there.
When we talk about continuing to honor a person's life, we talk a lot about this in our support groups, our homicide support groups and suicide support groups. And often it's not about things that the person had. It's about how do you keep that memory alive, not the memory of how they died. And often when it is a homicide or a suicide death or a trauma-type death, road accident, sudden death like that, we're so caught up in the details, or the details that are missing of that death, especially a homicide where you're into the investigation, trial, or no trial, whether someone's caught, then it goes on to the jail and parole and all of that. You get so caught up in all of that you forget about the person that has died, the years that that person was still alive, and not the death and the years since. So a lot of the time in our support groups we spend talking about that, remembering, not just remember, but remembering that person back into the family, into the community. And a lot of that is about that honoring. How have you honored? And it might not be at birthdays and anniversaries at Christmas time. It could be any other time where you just set that time apart, whether it's daily, monthly, yearly, to acknowledge that person and the years they were before they died.
It can be both. My bachelor's was in criminology too when I was doing that at the time. And I mean, I'd become fairly desensitized, which was actually kind of helpful. I don't think I had enough to deal with. I was in enough shock that I didn't want the added panic of, but how does this happen to good people, or how does this, no, it can happen to anybody. It's horrible, but it can. So I'm sort of glad I at least didn't have that level of worry. And sometimes it's therapeutic, sometimes it isn't. The times when it is, it's when it's a little more victim focused, a little more empathetic. Whereas I did a paper on the use of victim impact statements at mental health review board hearings. So I was actually reading the decisions. And that just depressed me so much because they would just gloss over the impact statement very quickly. And granted, that is not going to be the focus of a review board hearing where you're trying to determine if somebody is a significant risk to society. But I just wish it hadn't been glossed over like that, or in some cases, like, flat out contradicted. That was granted rare, but that's the part where I find it hard, where people mention victims, but they're sort of glossed over or disregarded, and that feels even worse than not mentioning them at all. It definitely feels very weird to me, because I feel like the way I'm expected to react and the way I actually react and my actual feelings are completely different and not what they're supposed to be. Like, you have this, or at least I had this image of someone who suffered a tragic loss, who sits in a dark room and sips at whiskey and stares out a window, and then eventually they don't need to do that anymore and they're okay. And it's completely missing all the weird emotional reactions you have, the fact that, you know, it took so long for me to, it took a while for me to actually accept that they were dead, that I was never quite sure that they wouldn't just walk in again. So it's strange. It's the best, if I had to summarize it in one word, it's weird, because it doesn't happen the way you expect it to. You don't react the way you're expected to. But it's in some ways, most other people keep trying to fit you into that box where you're going to be sad or you're okay, but you're not going to be angry, you're not going to laugh uncontrollably. I think letting go of the idea of justice made it a lot easier for me to not be so angry anymore. Because realistically, what could have happened? What could the criminal justice system have done? What could anybody have done that would make my parents any less dead? There's nothing. There's literally nothing. Nothing is going to change that. Maybe someone else would suffer, maybe they don't, but it doesn't actually mean I'm suffering any less. It doesn't mean my parents are alive again. So the only thing I could do, the only thing that helped me with the anger was to try to, and this wasn't conscious at all. It was sort of something I realized had happened later. But I ran out of steam, and eventually I was trying to focus on sorry, this is really hard to explain for me. It's always really hard to explain what I did. But eventually I was trying to focus on, you know, sort of moving forward, sort of incorporating this as a fact of my life that I now had to deal with. Because there was nothing anyone else could do that would make them not dead. And that was the part that was terrible. So, yeah, eventually I stopped. I was furious at the detectives. I absolutely hated them for so long. That was the easiest place to direct my anger, because they were the ones who seemed like they didn't care. It was protocol in Romania that if someone, if there's a witness that might be useful, like say their only daughter, or their coworkers or their friends or people who had actually seen them regularly in the last 20 years, if they're out of the country, you're not obligated to go get their statement. I had to actually fight to get a statement in. So there's a lot of anger at the way it was handled, at what felt like the complete lack of empathy on their part. But eventually I just sort of let go of getting justice, because I wasn't going to get them back.
Can I share something that you talked about in the support group?
Sure. I have no idea what it is. Okay.
I mean, we stress a lot about confidentiality, but you've shared so much. I think one of the things that stuck with me was how you grew up learning about the distrust Romanians have of the government and of the police services and anybody else like that in authority. That was all you heard from your parents, and that's why they left, right? So for you to go back there and try and get this sorted out, you knew was just going to be a big puzzle and a big mess. You were never going to get the truth or any of those answers, right?
They weren't trying to scare me. They were just telling me about their lives when they were younger, and those lives just consisted of the fact that you couldn't trust anybody because the authority figures were not there to help you. Authority figures were all incredibly corrupt. When I went to Romania in 2008 to get a passport, so we were in a government building, there was a sign with the phrase "Nu primim atenții," which is basically a euphemism for "we don't accept bribes." If in 2008 you still need to put that in a government building. So I definitely grew up without that sort of, they're the government or they're the police and they're going to help me. I never had that, so that was, sort of thankfully that wasn't something I had to then unlearn, and it didn't contribute to my shock. I was shocked enough already. I didn't also need to be surprised that the world was bad. I actually have a relevant answer to this. My parents had died in September, and I think in August, I applied to volunteer at a rape crisis center. If you know WAVA, that's where I applied. And they normally start their groups and they have trainings in September and January, but that September, that one was canceled. So in August, they'd emailed me and said, we would consider you for the January and we'll call you for an interview or whatever in the fall. And then I forgot about it because my parents died, and I absolutely did the thing where I could not tolerate other people's problems at all. I stopped eventually, but for a very long time, if someone complained about something, I'm like, really? Was somebody murdered? No? No? Then shut up. That went away. It was gradual. At first I couldn't talk about anything else, and then I'd slowly be able to, and I'd slowly realize that other people have problems, even if it's not the worst thing ever. And I did an interview in November for WAVA. I sort of didn't really know what else to do, so I went, and I told them my parents died. I don't know if I really got across that it was like 2 months ago, and I started training in January. And this sounds like just an asinine idea completely to start volunteering at a rape crisis center 4 months after your whole family dies. And it actually turned out fine. It was something I ended up being pretty good at. And when I was on the line and when I talk to people and they tell me their stories and their traumas and all that, I was completely focused on them. It wasn't about me. I was finally able to focus on something else, and in a twisted way, because what they were going through was so awful, I didn't have that same, oh, you don't have real problems because nobody was murdered. It was, oh, that's actually a horrible thing that happened to you. I'm going to listen, or I'll give you a referral if you need something, and I was just able to focus on their problems and not on mine. But honestly, I can't explain how that happened. But it's not impossible. And it doesn't mean you have to give up, even if you take a break from it for a bit.
I really wasn't expecting this. My heart is beating through my chest here. I immigrated here from former Yugoslavia, so we're sister countries. And my father was murdered in former Yugoslavia 25 years ago. And everything that you've mentioned, exactly. I was so young, I went there, I wanted justice. There is no justice, it's extremely corrupt. And bribery, lots of bribery to this day. And I think our countries are very similar. And to this day, I just wish I had answers. I don't know how I dealt with it. I didn't have any support at all. But there's so much out there now. I'm really happy for that, for everyone. But I'm angry still. I'm still angry that there's no justice. There's no answers. And he was a Canadian citizen. He immigrated my whole family here. He was the person who brought us all here. And it's really hard. Yeah, it's very, very, all the things you were saying, I was expecting conversation, but I don't know, yeah, we're very similar.